All right, hey everybody. I'm Rob Hughes, joined by Tim Darnell. We're talking a little bit of sports betting today. Tim, I guess I should introduce what you do too.
Rob, I'm a digital content.
Multi-talented.
Thank you. I'm a digital content producer here at the Atlanta News First Channel 46 here in Atlanta, and we are striving to provide all of our readers and viewers with the latest and most in-depth coverage of this year's historic 2022 midterm elections.
Yeah, and then this is just in general a platform for us to be able to go a little further in depth on some of the stories we've reported on, and that one for us today is sports betting, and specifically legalized sports betting in the state of Georgia, which of course does not exist right now.
Right.
That's been a discussion for a few years now, really ever since 2018 when individual states started going through and legalizing sports betting in a variety of forms. We've seen it in now live and legal in 31 states and legal in 5 more, so 36, but not operational yet. So Georgia is one of that handful of states that does not have legal sports betting.
It does, and it's important to draw a parallel. In 1991, Zell Miller, a Democrat here in Georgia, literally rode the issue of the Georgia lottery providing online or providing betting in a lottery for what would soon become the Hope Scholarship. And it was an issue that was controversial in the early 90s, late 1980s to early 90s. Zell Miller rode the issue all the way into the governor's mansion and then all the way into the United States Senate. So betting is legal in Georgia, but we're drawing a very strong parallel here. Online sports betting, where you place a FanDuel or Fantasy DraftKings or whatever bet on your phone through the app, is not legal in Georgia. And the reason the issue is really becoming so predominant politically is because we are missing out on literally hundreds of millions of dollars that could be generated for future educational scholarships through the Hope Scholarship. Another important distinction to make is that all gaming in Georgia is by law regulated through the Georgia Lottery. So any revenue generated from online legalized sports betting would have to go to educational purposes.
And the issue that legislators can't seem to agree on most recently is how that tax revenue from potential sports betting would be spent. So there seems to be a discrepancy there. And as a result, the bill, which has been proposed most recently by State Representative Ron Stevens and others, has been struck down in committee. And why don't we go ahead and play the story for some context at about 3 minutes long, and then we'll come back.
Ain't settling for 3 because life's a gamble.
Everywhere sports fans look,
Name is guaranteed. Gamble.
an enticing ad.
Lay it all on tonight's game or kiss it goodbye.
Hello, Fortune.
Sportsbooks are projected to spend $2 billion on advertising this year, partnering with the NFL and other major sports leagues to expand business. Right now, the American Gaming Association says sports betting is live and legal in 31 states and Washington, D.C.
That includes states such as Tennessee, which has an all-online form of sports betting. All the sports books are mobile or on another internet-connected device.
Our neighbors to the north have taken in nearly $75 million in tax revenue in less than 2 years. Jeff Zucodny reports on sports betting for Covers, watching closely as more states pass pro-gambling legislation.
So it really has been a state-by-state process where each one has kind of settled on the model that legislators there feel is right for them.
And yet, year after year,
Ladies and gentlemen, I need 29 of you, and I need you badly.
the model falls short in the Georgia State House.
But thanks to Brian Kemp, sports betting is illegal in Georgia. While Georgians still place bets, Kemp is forcing them out of state to do it, taking the tax dollars with them.
Gubernatorial Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams releasing an onslaught of campaign ads highlighting her support for legalized sports betting and alleging opposition from Governor Brian Kemp.
That means even when Georgia wins the bet, states like Tennessee get the tax money.
When we reached out for comment from the governor, we were told he has taken no position on sports betting and would work alongside legislative leadership to determine the best path forward.
It's just a shame that we've got to wait 2 more years from.
But State Representative Ron Stevens says it was legislative leadership who snuffed out his most recent push to legalize sports betting earlier this year.
If this thing had gotten to the House, it would have passed. It would have passed bipartisan.
Stevens says the hang-up happened in the House Rules Committee. He says representatives of the wealthiest districts in Georgia didn't like how the bill proposed tax revenue be used to help fund Hope scholarships and pre-K on a needs basis rather than merit.
It's unfortunate we didn't get the vote, and it's even more unfortunate that people of Georgia didn't get an opportunity to vote on it.
Still, the likeliest path forward appears to be a constitutional amendment, meaning the earliest sports betting could be put to a vote by the people of Georgia is November of 2024. Even as sports betting legislation has stalled, sportsbook giant FanDuel has quietly moved in here to Ponce City Market, building a tech hub and a promise to bring 900 employees to the city of Atlanta over the next several years. Again, all in a state where there are no legal sports betting options. Rob Hughes, Atlanta News First. City and FanDuel to bring a tech hub here for FanDuel, which of course is one of the biggest sports books going in the United States. And they are investing a lot of money and a lot of resources here in a city and in a state where there are no legal sports betting options.
And it's almost like you have to wonder, does FanDuel know something that we don't?
Of course.
Are they already sensing this momentum shift toward online sports betting becoming legal in Georgia? It's interesting, just yesterday we did a story on a new AJC University of Georgia poll in which Stacey Abrams seems to be trailing pretty significantly in her quest to become the nation's first African-American female governor this fall, trailing Brian Kemp by the latest poll showing about 10 points. Yet at the very same time, in the very same poll, many of her positions are popular among Georgians, one of which is her support for a constitutional amendment that would allow not only legalized sports betting, but also pari-mutuel betting and casino gambling here in Georgia. So this is another reason why the issue of online legalized sports betting has really become a hot topic here in the state.
Yeah, and so she wants to put it to a vote for Georgians. So, Georgians in polls that have been done by the AJC and others suggest that that would pass pretty handily, and that most Georgians would like to see sports betting and other gaming in the state of Georgia. And her idea is to use that money, that tax revenue that you would get from sports betting, and put it towards the gap, which I believe you mentioned earlier, between the Hope Scholarship and the real cost of tuition for a needs basis. So.
And one of your interviews, one of your excellent interviews in the package was from State Representative Ron Stevens down in Savannah, who is a very ardent supporter. He will tell you that we're only funding Hope at about 90% of what its actual applicants are. We're missing out on at least 10% of scholarships that could be funded through Hope. The big sticking point, as you mentioned, is how do you spend the money? Do you keep Hope Scholarship on a strictly merit-based only basis, which is what it is now, or do you expand it to a needs-based position? Anyone, I believe Stacey Abrams' platform is anyone with a C average would be eligible for a fully funded Hope Scholarship. That's a huge issue of contention among what really seems to be an issue that has garnered a lot of bipartisan support.
And that's what's interesting. You've seen some discussions and heard of discussions really between members of the same political party in some cases. I know that Ron Stevens finds supporters who are Democrats and people who are against him and his efforts to bring legalized sports gambling to Georgia that are members of his own party. And so he is basically, kind of alleged to us that some of the people who represent the state's most wealthy districts are not in favor of expanding this tax revenue to cover needs-based scholarships, that they'd rather keep it only merit-based as it is. And as a result, we've not seen this legalized sports betting bill be able to be pushed through to be put to a vote among Georgians.
And what's going to be very interesting, Rob, just coming up next week, Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp will debate each other twice next week, and all with the debates televised on Georgia Public Broadcasting. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not she brings this issue up. Could this be a similar issue that if she were to really push it forward, could she follow the same wave into the governor's mansion that Zell Miller did back in 1991? As you said, it's an issue that among Georgia's wealthier state legislative districts, the lawmakers representing those districts are not in favor of expanding Hope to a merit-based position. If Stacey Abrams were to win, it's kind of an interesting scenario. We'll know in less than 4 weeks. But if she were to garner a victory over Brian Kemp in a historical election, could this be an issue that perhaps she and the opposing party could find a little bit of bipartisan meeting ground? There's virtually no scenario that shows Democrats gaining control of the state House or the state Senate really within the next 2 to 4 election cycles. So even if Stacey Abrams does win, she will have to work with a majority GOP state legislature. Can they find some common ground? This could be possibly a legislative accomplishment for her, but she's got to win the election first.
Yeah, and if that were to happen, she is promising to go hard after bringing that sports betting to becoming a reality. What's interesting, and this is kind of just a what-if scenario, is Governor Kemp in the past has been on the record as not in favor of sports betting. Most recently, he just told us he's taking no position. I think rather, basically, just saying mum on the subject rather than coming up with a position, is probably knowing how Stacey Abrams is attacking this. Certainly don't want to give voters any reason to see a difference in policy making between the two of them, even as he has been opposed to it in the past. But I'd be interested if Governor Kemp had been in favor of sports betting, if he would have been able to assist pushing this through and kind of working with those representatives of some of the wealthier districts in Georgia. Obviously, it hasn't been the case, so those representatives were able to kill the bill before it reached a vote to bring it to a constitutional amendment.
Right, and like you said, if Governor Kemp were in favor of it, he has solid majorities in both the House and the Senate. He can really push through anything he wants. He has a very effective floor leadership team in both the House and the Senate. If this is something that he really wanted and was in support of, we would have already seen it happen. However, putting a constitutional amendment on a ballot in Georgia doesn't require the governor's support or signature. It simply has to have a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. So regardless of the outcome, legislative leaders, if they are able to come to some sort of meeting of the minds and agreement in terms of how to use the revenues generated from online sports betting, really don't need the governor's support. Except from a really public relations or bully pulpit sort of platform.
We're talking a significant amount of money too. I mean, we're talking, we mentioned in the story, our neighbors to the north, Tennessee, just under $75 million in less than 2 years is what they've generated in revenue, tax revenue from sports betting. They put a 20% tax on the online sports books, and so that $75 million comes from that. That broke records from Indiana and other states that had legalized it before Tennessee in terms of online only by a wide margin. I think we could expect the same thing for Georgia.
No doubt.
You could do DraftKings and FanDuel. I think we would put Tennessee's numbers to shame in a short period of time. So I think it's fair to suggest that you'd be upwards of $50 or $60 million in tax revenue per year initially, and the number could be significantly more than that, depending if Georgians come out en masse to bet online. But again, the earliest, if they go the current route in terms of trying to put it on the ballot, would be the presidential election in 2024. So a little more than 2 years from now.
Which is not a bad place to put it. I mean, you're going to have very high turnout, obviously, in any presidential election year. The Georgia lottery, when it was implemented in the early 90s, hugely successful. One of the nation's most successful educational funding tools through the lottery. It will be massively popular here in Georgia. All 4 of Atlanta's major sports franchises or major league sports franchises are in favor of it. There really isn't any professional major league team out there that does not or would not welcome the increased attention and revenue that it can bring their product.
Yeah, from a fan engagement standpoint, it's just another opportunity for those franchises to pull in bigger numbers. So it was a slow process. It started among some franchises and among some professional sports leagues, but now you've seen it. I believe I said in the story too, sports books in the U.S. have spent more than $2 billion advertising alone, and you see these huge partnerships both with sports media companies like ESPN's coming to an agreement, it sounds like, with the sports book, and the DraftKings was the official sponsor of the most recent Super Bowl. So they're spending big money to push this in front of a bunch of people, and yet there's about 14 or 15 states where there's no legalized sports betting at this moment.
Eventually, with FanDuel headquartering or opening an office in Midtown,
a big office
a
too.
Huge tech hub at Pod City Market, one of Midtown's most recognizable mixed-use developments. With FanDuel here, supporters have to be really hoping that the lure of all of this revenue for educational purposes here in Georgia, in a state that still lags regularly, unfortunately, behind in many educational and public school merits. You have to believe that the hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue is just going to make this package or this measure impossible to resist any longer. So we'll see over the next couple of years.
Yeah, FanDuel's coming to Atlanta is either a really large endorsement for how friendly it is to do business in the state of Georgia, regardless of whether their entire model of their business is legal or illegal, or they know something, as you mentioned, that we don't know, and they see it as an inevitability. It does seem like it's just a matter of time since what we can gather, the majority of legislators and Georgians support legal sports betting in the state. It's just a matter of pushing that through among a pretty powerful group that has been resistant to this point.
And like you said, it will be a major topic. It's certain to come up in the next legislative session. Georgia's legislature convenes in January. Ron Stevens, Jeff Mullis, several other folks who have been behind this effort have already said this is going to come up once again. Whether or not there's been enough forward momentum in the past to actually bring it to a floor vote. As you said, some very powerful lawmakers, veteran lawmakers from some of Metro Atlanta and Georgia's most wealthy districts have really been responsible for the issue not coming to the floor. And yet, we still have a very active Democratic Party. There are virtually no Democratic legislators who I have seen who are opposed to this idea. They do not have the political capital to push through a merits-based scholarship effort at all. It's just not going to happen. So now we have to simply, or to a needs-based merit scholarship is what I should have said. So it will remain a merit-based scholarship. Whether or not that's enough to persuade some Democrats to come on board in terms of more bipartisan support, we'll have to wait and see.
And Ron Stevens, too, you mentioned this. I think that with that forward momentum, they're going to bring this up earlier in this legislative session. I think that they kind of ran out of time. There's a lot of things that they have to get to in those legislative sessions. There's a limited amount of time, and I think that time ran out on them in terms of trying to sway their position and to bring it to the floor for a vote. So if they bring it up earlier and make it more of a priority this time around, you'd like to think there's enough time in there to get the support needed in order to bring that to the ballot again in about 2 years and 2 weeks or so.
Right, 2 years and 2 weeks for the 2024 presidential election, if it does make it to the ballot, but it's going to take a lot of legislative hand-holding and arm-wringing, so to speak, among the Republican Party in order to overcome people in their own party who are opposed to this issue. Let's also we should not forget, even though perhaps some folks might think that it's a kind of a fringe opposition, but there's also the moralistic issue of whether or not gambling should even be legal in Georgia. It is. Georgia is still a conservative Bible Belt leaning state, so we should not discount any sort of public outcry in terms of the morals of allowing additional gambling to go on within the confines of Georgia.
And I think most people would admit, even supporters, that there needs to be the correct and the proper infrastructure in place to support sports wagering or other forms of betting too, in terms of what you mentioned, gambling addiction possibly and other things. So anytime you see DraftKings or other sports books, FanDuel, you'll always see that kind of disclaimer or associated promo for those who might need to seek help if they feel like what they're doing and gambling is getting out of control. So there needs to be the proper safety nets. I think supporters of sports betting and other gaming recognize that.
And you reached out to Andre Dickens, mayor of Atlanta. One of his comments that's included in the story is he would really want to see some social safety net provisions for individuals who have this kind of addiction before he really fully got on board with it. So that's an important issue as well.
I think that pretty much covers it.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Thanks for your time.
fascinating.
Wonderful story here about Rob Hughes.
Enjoyed putting it together. Sports is a topic. We got the Braves in the NLDS right now. Everybody is talking about the Braves, of course, and there's a lot of sports fans in the state of Georgia. There's very few states that are as good as sports states in general as Georgia. So there'll be a lot of interest. Whether or not there's enough support, we'll see. So, Tim, thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Good job. Thank you.